you're planning on releasing a game using the Godot Game engine, you absolutely need to make sure that you're setting up your resolution options correctly. A lot has changed since I released my tutorial series last year for Godot 3.5. Gone are the days where you need to ruin your UI to give your players extra frames if they need it, or go to extra length to scale your game with your viewport while keeping your UI on a separate layer. It's become substantially more straightforward. But unfortunately, with all these amazing tools, those old videos aren't really applicable. Everything's changed. Another huge feature that is coming out with Godot 4.2 is AMD FSR 2.2 for scaling. This is massive, guys. We're going to be creating a ton of tools in this video. A small point for this tutorial, I'm using the 4.2 beta so that I can demonstrate AMD FSR 2.2. VSync is also bugged in 4.1. The project is down below if you want to check out the completed project. Let's get started. Okay, so let's take a look at the project, how it comes. We've got a directional light, a world environment, and a camera. It's just floating around this scene, which I'll leave a link to and credits for below. The project settings itself, they should be pretty stock standard. The viewport width and height should match what normally comes in Godot. I can see that I've got VSync on here, but I'm actually going to disable that so that my project matches exactly how you should see yours. I'll also leave a link for this project down in the description so you can download it and follow along with the visuals as well. Okay, let's start adding control nodes. I'm going to add my first control node. I'm going to call it something like options example. Nothing fancy here. I'm going to click the anchor presets and I'm just going to click full rect. Okay, so I'm going to add a H box. Once again, I'm going to use that anchor to click full rect. I'm going to click and make the alignment center for this H box container. And then I'm going to add a V-box. You guys don't have to follow this exactly. This is just how I like to set up my menus so that they appear in the middle of the screen. And I'll rename this to be called Options Settings. Okay, so we'll add our first button here. It's going to be an Options button. These are nice little drop-down boxes that we can add. I'm going to come back up to the Options setting and add a script. I'm just going to call it Options Setting and save it directly in the base of this project. That's fine for me. I'm going to delete the process function. We won't be needing that. And the first thing I'm going to do is add in this options button. You can click this and hold control. And when you drop it, it'll add an onReady var for you. The next thing I'm going to do is paste in a list of resolutions for us to select from. I thought it would be a little bit easier than typing this out for you. You can copy a few of these down. It doesn't have to be an exhaustive list. Mine is just a set of common resolutions. So the first function that we are going to write is going to be called add_resolutions, and we're just going to add this dictionary to our option button. So we're going to create a for loop. So we'll type for in resolutions. And in that we will type options button. I'm actually going to rename this variable because I think it can be a little bit clearer as to what it is. I'm going to rename it to resolution_option button. And I'll come down here and I'll just type resolution option button dot add item, and it will just be R. That's all there is right now. The one thing we'll have to remember to do is actually add this to the ready function. You can see here I forgot to check that. So the one thing I think I will also do is change the alignment on my box container, my VBox container, to be center as well. So this shows up in the middle. And then I'll add this to the ready function so that we can actually see the list get populated. And as you can see now, there will be a list of resolutions. Obviously they don't do anything, so we can add that functionality in. We'll have to come back to the project and we'll click on the option button node, and we'll click on node and we'll connect the signal item selected to our script. I've got a lot of nodes here for the project. I'm just going to hide all that and come down to the options setting node and just click on that. All right. So this signal provides us with an index that we can actually use to look up the resolution dictionary. So go the ID is equal to resolution option button dot get item text, which is actually what we need for the dictionary. And we can look up with the index. And once we've got the index, we can actually query the resolution. I'm going to call getWindow.setSize And within that function, I'll type resolutions, square bracket, and I'll pass in that ID that we just did. And that's all we need. We can run this now and we can start to see that work. And as you can see, we're changing the window size, which is pretty awesome. You'll notice that the window bounces around a lot. And that is mostly because I'm pretty sure it resizes from the top left and inwards. So rather than the center. In Godot 3.5, there was a function that allowed you to do this relatively easily, but that's gone in Godot 4. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to take in the entire virtual desktop area in order to assign the correct position. So I've got a standard 2-screen setup, but you might have something different. In order to set the Windows position, we need to take into account the entire desktop area. So starting from far left to far right, I would need to account for 2 screens here. So that's why we need to do it this way. I've tested this in a few different configurations. I've still only got 2 screens, but I've tested this by unplugging one or moving its position in the virtual desktop area just to see how this function behaves. And so far I've seen it work pretty well. First, we need to get the center of the screen that we're currently on, which is going to be displayServer.screenGetPosition plus displayServer.screenGetSize divided by 2. And that'll be the exact center point on the screen that the window is currently on. And now we need to get the size of the window, which is going to be getWindow.getSize with decorations. It can also just be getSize, but it won't be exactly in the center. It doesn't really matter, you can use either one. The last function we'll call is getWindow.setPosition, and within this function we'll pass in the center screen minus the window size divided by 2. And that'll be the center of the current screen where we want our window to be. And then last but not least, we need to remember to put this where we want the window to be centered. So after we select a new resolution, we're going to center the screen. Okay, so let's see this in action. And you can see now that this is behaving the way that we want it to. It's showing up in the center of the screen no matter what size we make. There's a little bit of a flicker. That's pretty normal. I think most people could forgive you for that. Just makes things a lot easier when you're trying to like resize a game to suit your particular needs. Okay. All right, great. We're cracking along nicely here. I think the next step in this point is to probably take us to a full screen mode. Because right now we can select the different resolutions when we're in a windowed mode, which is super convenient, but we don't have anything to put us into full screen mode. So let's add that in. We'll click on the Add Node button and we'll add a checkbox. I am going to rename this checkbox. I'll just keep the checkbox part and add full screen underscore at the start so that we know what it is. And I'll also do the same for my resolution button because I didn't do that. So I'm going to do that now, and I'll also need to rename the node path for the variable that we put into the script. And you can also just click and drag it. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to control, click and drag that next variable so that we've got a full path to it. We'll come into this full screen checkbox and I'll add some text so we know what it is. So I'll type full screen in the text here, and I'll connect the toggled signal to our script here. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward. As a comparison to Godot 3, there used to only be 2 options, which was windowed and full screen. We've actually got 4 now, so we can't just pass that variable on. We could probably do something a little bit more complicated with it, but I'm going to keep this simple. And so if it is toggled on, I'm going to set the window to full screen mode. And so we'll see this in action here. I'll type getWindow.setMode, and I'll put the mode in there. You can see these automatically come up, but if they don't for you, you can just type capital W window.mode full screen. And then I'll put an else and I'll say the exact same thing. In fact, I'm going to copy it and just change that window.mode full screen to mode windowed. And as you can see, we've got a few other options: minimized, maximized, all those kinds of things. Probably things you don't need if you're making a game, but you never really know. I know Godot has become a lot more popular for creating applications, which is probably why these options are there, which is nice to have, but we don't need them right now. So we're just going to do something simple like this. Okay, so that should work, no problems. We'll run the scene here. Let's tick that. And we can see we're in full screen. And as just a quick example now, you can see that the drop-down box no longer works. We're going to get into addressing that in a little moment. But as you can see, out of full screen mode, we've got no problems, and we can click to go into full screen mode. The text doesn't replace itself. There's a couple of things we need to polish up. But for now, things are working pretty good. The one thing we're going to need to add here is that if you take it out of full screen mode, it'll go back to whatever position you had it moved to. That might be something that you want, but I'm going to add in the centered function after we come back into window mode. So we can move the window off into some random position, but if we full screen it and then unfull screen it, it's going to come back to center. That's just me. You don't have to do that. Okay, things look pretty nice. I'm going to create a function now that helps keep track of variables that may or may not be set to true or false depending on how you set your scene up. And you don't want to have to worry about making sure things are checked, like example, a full screen checkbox when you run your game. So I'm going to create a function called check variables. I'm going to get access to the window because we're going to need that a lot for this one. And I'm also going to get access to the mode, which is something we just set before. So I'm going to go _window.getMode. And we're just going to query here if mode is equal to window.mode full screen. We're going to set that checkbox to be toggled without the signal. So we can say full screen checkbox.set pressed no signal, and we'll just type true. Okay, so now if we go in here and we set it to be starting in full screen, which is a pretty common parameter to have, when we run the game, we can see that that checkbox will be checked. Actually, it won't because I forgot again to add that function to our ready function. So I'll just come back in here and I'll add it to the ready function and we'll run the game. Okay, cool. One thing that I think we should do is when we start the game and we're adding the resolutions, if the window is set to a size in that list, it should be selected to begin with. So what we can do is we can create a variable here called current resolution, and we can query the size of the window. So we'll go get window.getSize, and that returns a vector2i, which we can use to compare against these resolutions as we go through them. And we'll also need to create an ID to keep track of these, which is an optional parameter of the add item function in the option button. So we'll go var ID equals 0, and then we'll come down to the resolution option button.add item, and we'll add that second parameter ID. Okay, so as we're looping through the resolutions, we will check to see if the current resolution matches one of these. So I'll type if resolutions square bracket r is equal to current resolution. Then I'll select that option in our option button. I'll type resolution option button dot select, and I'll pass in the ID, and then we'll need to remember to increment that ID. And now you'll see that it's selected 1920 by 1080 to start the game. So one other thing that I was struggling with when I was working on this is that the label sometimes doesn't update when you're going between full screen. Even though I've got the option button to select an option, it'll just read out like a wrong one. And it doesn't work. Obviously, when you go to full screen mode, you want to go to full screen mode. You don't want to select a resolution option from this drop-down list. That's not going to work. So we need a function to sort of override that label. And we're going to use that as sort of like a way that we tell people what resolution it is. So we can actually set the text directly on that option button, and it'll just show up on there. And if they're dropping down and it's different, it's not the worst thing in the world. So we're just going to do that. And I think that will work a lot better for most applications. Okay, so the next function that we want to add in is a little bit of a helper function to help us set the text on our drop-down box when we're moving between full screen and windowed mode. So it's just going to be called set resolution text, and we're going to create a variable called resolution text, and we'll make that equal to, and it's going to be a log one. It's going to be str for string, which is the function that we use for strings now in Godot 4, and it's going to be around, and it's going to be get window dot get size, and we're just going to get the x from the size of the window. Get window dot get size dot x. Copy that bit of code so we can use it. We'll add an x, and we'll go string get window dot get size dot y. Okay, and after that, we will just set the resolution option button's text to be that resolution. So that way, when we go to full screen mode, we can just set that text. It's not actually going to be selected, and we're actually going to make that disabled pretty soon, I think, when we're in full screen mode. But more on that in a little bit. Okay, so now we can call this function when we go to full screen mode. I'll copy that and we'll go to full screen mode. It'll be in here. I'll run this, and something that you'll notice is that it doesn't always work. It's like a different number, and I guess the window is in the process of resizing when I'm calling that function. So what I'm going to do is just create a timer, a very short timer. I'll type get tree dot create timer, and it'll be very short, like 0.05 seconds. And I'll connect the timeout function here. I'll just timeout.connect, and I'll put the name of that function in. And so that way there's a little bit of delay to give the window time to resize. And I found that worked really well. So we'll run this again. And you can see now it's working exactly how I want it to, pretty much. We're probably better off. See, now the text is set to that, and it's actually a different size. So we're better off putting that, rather than just in the full screen option, to just put that at the bottom of that function where we're going between full screen and windowed. So I'll move that getTree.createTimeout to the bottom of this function so that it'll update after it's been called, and the resolution will be correct. Okay, so now we can see it's starting to choose a resolution label that's actually correct when we go between full screen and windowed, which is much nicer. You can sort of see the delay between when you go to full screen and windowed, where the text gets updated later, but you know, that works. Let's not worry too much about it. The functionality is there. The label makes sense for the user. We do have to override the text for whatever reason, I guess, just because the window resizes slower than the function call. Okay, so the next thing that you're going to notice is that obviously I'm going to full screen and I can't resize the window. Now, in the olden days, when I was a young kid, when you change the resolution, the entire resolution of your screen changed. It's not like that anymore. We don't need to do that. Currently, with how we've got the project set up, the full screen is automatically going to match the resolution of the screen that we're on. So we don't really need to add support for the resolution of the user screen. As long as we set up our UI properly, that's going to be supported. And this, I guess, is mostly talking in 3D. 2D is a little bit different, because for like how you've set that game up might need to be a set resolution, especially if you're working with pixel art. That's a different conversation. But for 3D, you really just want to keep the stretch mode to be disabled, and unless, you know, perhaps you're doing like a very specific thing like a PS1 or like a Nintendo 64 style appearance. But if you're just making a regular 3D game, stretch mode, disable and keep is the way to go. And I'll show you how you can reduce the resolution of your viewport without affecting the UI like it was, 10 years ago. I mean, even today, still some games do this, but it's really not necessary. We can work around that. Godot's really good. And it is honestly like 2 lines of code. So we're going to add a slider to the scene. I'll come up to the plus button. I'll just click on the option setting so it gets added into the right spot. I'll type slider. We want a horizontal slider. Obviously, it could be a vertical slider. It could be a drop-down box. A lot of different things it could be, but I'm going to make it a slider. I'm going to drag this above the full screen checkbox just because I think it looks better. It makes more sense to be close to the resolution option box that we just put in. Okay, so let's add some text to go alongside that. So I'm going to add a HBox so that they get aligned nicely. I'll put the slider in the HBox and I'll rename that HBox to be something like scale box, just so that it's got a nice name. So let's set up the minimum and maximum values in this slider. The minimum value is going to be 50 and the maximum value is going to be 200. I'm going to make the step 5. Now the minimum and maximum value needs to be 50 and 200. You can't scale anything beyond that within Godot, so there's no point making it any higher. It's just going to default to that upper limit and lower limit. And yeah, we've got 5-step just because it feels a bit nicer when you're sliding. And we do want it to tick on borders. Okay, so for the layout, to make this work within a HBox, we're going to have a custom minimum size. And this is in pixels, so I'm going to make mine 100 and maybe even make it 200 so that it's just wider, so that it's nicer to play with rather than making the HBox scale it down to like a tiny size for whatever reason. Okay, and I'm going to make the value 100. That's the starting value. That makes sense because we start off at a high scale. I'll rename the slider to be called scale slider. And the next thing we need to do is add some text so we know what the scale is. Click on the little plus button here. I'll just type a label. We'll add a label in and we'll type in 100%. And we'll put a dash there and it'll just be 1920 by 1080. We're going to set this by code. It's just there so that the UI looks the way it looks and we get it looking nice. I'll give this label a name because we're going to need to rename it often. We'll call it the scale label. And we're going to update that every time we change the slider. Okay, so the signal we want to connect is the value change signal. And this is going to be really easy. The functionality is going to be pretty easy to set up and we'll add some UI stuff around it to make it look good. So on scale slider value changed, we are going to get the resolution scale. It needs to be a percentage value. So we're going to actually take the value from our slider and divide it by 100. You could, of course, set your slider up to be decimal points, and that would be fine too. But I didn't do that. So make sure it's a float. I found with what I do in the future, parts of this video that just works better. So we'll create a variable to update the resolution text. I'm actually going to go back up to the resolution text function and take the exact same thing. We're going to need to add a couple of things here. However, we are going to need to multiply it by the resolution scale because that's essentially what we're doing. So I'll do that on both the X and the Y. And we'll also need to round that because we're going to get decimal places and we don't really want that for our UI. So I'll round that so that we just get whole numbers and it looks a lot more readable. It's not going to be as accurate, but like not a big deal. So we're going to need to get access to this scale label. I'll drag and drop that up the top so that we have it. And it will also need the slider. I'll drag that in. Clean up this mess a little bit. So I'll type scale label dot set text, and the text will be a string, and it'll be the value, which will just be anywhere between 50 and 200, which is that there. And then I will add the percentage sign and a dash and a space, and then I'll add the resolution text, which we set up before. And so that our slider will display the resolution and the value of the scale. And then all we need is get viewport.set scaling 3D scale, and it's going to take a float and we'll pass in the resolution scale, which we set at the very start of this function. And that's all you need to do. We can run this now and you can start to see this in action. Interestingly, I found it a bit difficult to see for this particular model that we've got. You can start to see like the jagged edges and stuff like that on that 50% scale. 960 by 540, which is the actual resolution of the viewport. And as you can see, it doesn't affect the UI, which is just amazing. This is really, really great stuff if you're running full screen 3D. You don't need to have like a drop down menu like we've seen in previous videos. I'm gonna come back into the script and I'm gonna disable that resolution option button when we are in full screen mode. So if we're in full screen mode, that won't be changeable, and instead you'll need to use the slider to change your resolution. So I'll come up and I'll also check that in the if mode full screen, and I'll set it toggle to true. And so that way we're not going to confuse people when they're working with this. If they're in windowed mode, they can use that to quickly set a resolution that they might want. But if you're in full screen mode, we want you using this. So the next major thing that we want to add in is to choose the scaler we want. Godot has bilinear scaling, which you saw before, which is that jagged edges stuff. And you've also got the option to add in AMD FSR 2.2, 1.1, like all these other scalers. We're going to add in to AMD FSR 2. It's an open source scaler, kind of similar to DLSS. Very powerful stuff. Looks amazing. You're going to get to see it in a second. If you're making a 3D game in Godot, you absolutely need to put this in your game. So we're going to create an option button. I'm going to call this scaler. And unlike the other one that we set with code, we're actually going to have to do this one manually. Maybe we could do it with code. I don't know. Doesn't matter. So first item is just going to be called scaler. And I'm going to set this to disabled and separator. And actually on the selected box here, I'm going to set that to 0, which is the option for scaler. So that'll just be set when the game starts. And the other one will be called bilinear. And I'll add an element here and it will be called AMD FSR 2.2. Okay, and they'll just be ID 1 and 2. We'll connect the signal item selected. And for this one, we're just going to match the index. We know that there's only 2, so it's going to be nice and simple. I'll type match index, and the function is really straightforward. We'll get a copy of the viewport to start with, just to make things a little bit more neater. And I'll type underscore viewport.set scaling 3D mode, and you can see now that I've got a couple of options to choose from, and they disappeared on me. Okay, but we can type viewport.scaling 3D mode FSR bilinear. Just make sure that you've got the right one for the right option selected. So number 1 for me is bilinear. So if I'm hitting 1 on the index, that's what I want to be setting it to. And underneath that, I'll make 2 the next condition, and we'll do the exact same piece of code, but we'll change it to AMD FSR 2. Okay, so now we can run the game. You can see now if I can drop it down to 50% on AMD FSR, you can see straight away the difference between these two. AMD FSR looks so much better than bilinear. And there's a couple of artifacts here and there. You can see this as the tram pulls up. There's some weird artifacts, especially if you're looking at it where the lanterns are, or it passes through there. But other than that, it is great. Looks so good. I can see there was a big frame drop when I came around this corner with the camera, and I don't know if that's because of the scene or because of FSR. I'm not too sure, honestly. Set it back down to 50% and it worked really well. One other thing is that if you're using AMD FSR, the docs say that you should lock it to 4 particular options. I'm going to set these up now. I think that's why I was getting frame drops, because I wasn't choosing one of these 3 options. You can see you've got ultra quality, quality, balanced, and performance. And so these are the options that you need to set it to. So what we need to do is if someone chooses the AMD FSR scaler, we need to lock off that slider and just introduce a drop-down box for those options. So I'm going to create an option button. I'm going to put it underneath the scaler, and I'll put FSR options. The reason we don't want to do this for the bilinear one is because you can super scale with that. So you can make it double the resolution, but you can't do it with AMD FSR. So the same exact thing as before. We're going to create an option button. We're going to create a bunch of items for it. We'll create the first one, we'll make it FSR options, disabled separator, we'll set the selected item to be number 0. So that's selected at startup. We'll come and we'll type these out. We've got performance, we've got balanced, we've got quality, and we've got ultra quality. And you can see I get a little bit turned around on where to put these. It was a long recording. It's my first day back from holiday, guys. It's not really. Performance, balanced, ultra quality, quality. I got really confused. Balance. Yeah, we got 2 there, bro. Just chuck that one in there. Okay, good. Okay, so these are the 4 you want. So we're going to make it so that this only shows up when we are using the FSR options. So I'm going to create a variable there really quickly, just click and drag it in. And when we choose the FSR scaler from the scaler options, we're going to make that visible. So we go FSR options.show, and we'll do the exact opposite when we choose bilinear. We're going to hide these options because we don't need them anymore. We'll run that so you can see how that looks when we choose bilinear. We're going to see FSR options and all these things here. And you can see this frame struggling at 100% FSR. It's not supposed to be done that way. So that's why we need to introduce these options. The other thing we're going to do is the scale slider. We'll make that editable only in bilinear mode. So we've got the scale slider. The function that we need to use is set editable. It's exclusive to ranges somehow, for some reason. I don't know why. Scale slider dot set editable true for bilinear and false for FSR. We don't want to be using it. Okay, so let's see how that works. We can use the scaler. If we go to FSR, we can't. Great. That's exactly how we want it to look. Okay, so let's connect the signal for these FSR options. We'll connect item selected to the script, it'll be right below this one. And we'll do the exact same thing. We'll just create a match index. I'm just going to copy that because I'm lazy. And it'll just be from 1 to 4 this time. I'm going to type pass in here just so I can type out the numbers. And conveniently, we already have something that sets the scale. So I'm going to use that. So on scalar slider value change, that's the function that was created from the signal that we connected for the slider. We can just recycle that and just pass in the value that we want. And I'm going to copy that, make sure it's a float. The next one will be 59. The next one will be 67. And the last one will be 77. So those are the 4 values that AMD recommends. And we're going to stick to those. So just make sure that they match the documentation. Okay, let's run this now. Okay, we'll choose AMD FSR and we'll choose performance. All right, and that's down to 50%. You can see the frames just get back to normal and work well. Let's go up to ultra quality. Looks great. I'm really impressed with how it looks. And yeah, you can see the improvement between balance to performance and all that. You can definitely see that when it gets to ultra quality. To me personally, I find it indistinguishable from like a full 100% bilinear. Still getting that frame drop around this corner. I don't know if I think that's specific to this project. This mesh is something I just downloaded from the internet. I don't know how well it's optimized. So let's look at the FPS there and you can see that it's a big drop when I come around that corner. I don't know. That's all I'll say. I'll also point out that it looks way worse in the recording because I am using my GPU to record as well. So I think as it's getting more taxing for the recording, for Godot to run this project, I'm also dropping frames on my recording. So it doesn't look that bad. So the next thing we're going to do is add in VSYNC so that we have that option. It's going to matter when it comes to scaling and all this FPS stuff that it relates to, especially for me demonstrating it. So it's mostly maybe a demonstration tool at this point. But I'm going to add a label that shows FPS. So that's really easy. So you don't have to do this. This is just so that you guys can see while I'm running the game, the kind of FPS that we're seeing on the screen. So I'll add a label in here. I'll call it FPS. I'm going to it's going to be an arbitrary position, which is fine. And I'll add a script to this so that we can set the FPS. It's just a single line. And in the process function here, I'll just call set text. And the exact function we want to use is engine.getFrames per second. And that's it. It'll just display the frames per second. Make sure you wrap that in a string function and close the brackets off. And we're good to go. That's all you need for a frame counter. A little bit of bonus tutorial there. And you can see there it says 59, which is pretty accurate. All right, and if we 2 times scale everything, it's still running at 59. If we put in the AMD FSR, we change the scaler and all that kind of stuff. As we go around the corner here, we can see the frames drop, all that kind of good stuff. I'm just trying to see if it's related to AMD FSR, because every time I've come around this corner, we've come around. And you can see that that actually ran pretty well. So I don't know, maybe it's something to do with AMD. At 50% it runs okay. This tram is basically cancer for the frames. Don't know. Okay, so let's add some VSync to this. It's just going to be another toggle button, checkbox I should say, just another checkbox button. Okay, so we'll add that checkbox. We'll make sure that it's in our VBox here, and I'll just rename it to VSync stink. Stink. VSync checkbox, and I'll type VSync enabled in the text for that. Okay, so in the toggled options, we'll connect that to our options setting script. And you've actually got like 4 options for VSync, but I'm just going to set this toggle to be on or off. So I'll say if toggled on, we'll type display server.window set VSync mode. And you can see these options here. You've got adaptive, disabled, enabled, and mailbox. We're just going to use enabled and disabled for now, but you could expose a drop-down box or something for your users, but they'd need to understand what these options are. So I think it's better just to have like on or off, but you can do what you want. Okay, so we've got VSync, and then obviously for the else, disabled. We want to come back up to the checked variables function that we set up at the start, and we also want to check if VSync mode is enabled. So we can type if display server.get VSync mode is equal to display server.vsync enabled, and then we can just set that checkbox to be toggled. Make sure we've got that variable in, so we can drag and drop that up there. Then we can go vsync checkbox.set press no signal is equal to true. Okay, so nice and easy there. We'll run the game. And you can see it's ticked, and I'll uncheck it, and you can see the frames go up to 161. I'll double the scale. You can see they drop down to 105. And I'll drop it down to 50%, and you can see they jump. They don't change at all. I actually don't know about this. It's definitely something going on with this mesh. It's doesn't really seem to care what scale I've got it at. It still runs at pretty much the same. AMD FSR, same kind of deal. It starts off high at 300, but drops down to like 69. I don't know. I actually don't know what's going on with this mesh, but you can see the differences that sort of seem to happen here. We'll check it back to VSync, and it's back to 59 frames, and then it pops up when you uncheck it to 161, but then it's down, and it really chugged around that corner again. But yeah, don't know, it's all over the spot, but still it's very cool. I definitely think you need to add these options into any game that you're shipping. It is a really nice touch to have these available to your users. One thing that you'll notice is possible to do with this current setup is that you could put it in windowed mode, drop it down to 800 by 600, which is pretty much the smallest you'd make any kind of screen when you're playing a game, and then you can also downscale it 50%. So you can get a really small resolution here. I mean, if someone has a potato for a computer, then maybe it's possible. You might want that. You might not want it. You could also make it disabled. You could disable the scaler when you're in windowed mode. It's totally up to you. The function's there. You know what to do. Okay, so one thing that you might have noticed is that when we are changing from full screen to windowed mode, we're not updating the slider and we're not updating the resolution label here, and it's a little bit confusing to look at. Now, I think the scale is still accurate, so if we go to full screen, we're still at 50%. You can still see the jaggies all along the edges here, but the actual scale resolution text is wrong. Now, what I think we should do is just reset it to 100 anytime there's a change in the window size, because we don't really know what the player's trying to do, and it's probably a little bit confusing if they're trying to maximize frames or something like that. I don't really know, but this is what I'm going to do because it's also very easy. So the easiest way to do this is to come down to the set resolution text, and we need to call two. I'll show you this in a second. So we can just get the scale slider and we can set value. We can call set value no signal, or we can call set value. I'm going to show you guys set value for a second, because according to the docs, I will point out, make sure the value passed in is a float. Otherwise this function doesn't work. Under the range, it says range is current value. The change in this property, even via code, will trigger a value change signal. Now, we would imagine that the scale slider's signal for value changed would go to this method and it would do all the things we needed to do, update the resolution scale. So I got a printout here. I'm just going to print out the value. And so the other thing before we run the game is under the option button item selected, we're going to also reset the resolution scale. So I'm going to call set resolution text here as well. And so at this point, at every stage where we're changing the screen size, we should be updating that slider and triggering a signal. I'll run this. I'll jump out of full screen. And so we should be expecting to see a printout every time we change this, but we don't. I don't know what it is. Like if the signal's not firing or if it's a bug, I'm not too sure. I have to dive deeper into that. But for the sake of this particular lesson, if I can find my bearings, I'm going to change this to set value no signal, just for future proofing this, so we don't call it twice if this eventually gets fixed, or maybe I'm misunderstanding something. I don't know. But we can go and just grab the function and we can call it directly. And we'll pass in 100 as well. So if you think you know why, let me know. So we'll run this again. And we'll just jump down into windowed mode and you can start to see those printouts. So it's actually working and we are setting the correct resolution. Details here. And maybe I'm going overboard with the labeling here. This is just an example, so if you guys want to change this stuff, feel free. It's totally up to you. You guys know the functions now, so you can organize your UI the way you like. But yeah, so that's a weird quirk, but we've got it working. Let's move on to the next thing I want to show you guys. Okay, so the next thing that we want to start working on is the ability to switch screens now that we've got all this other stuff working. So we're going to add an option button here, and it's going to be a similar setup as before. So I'll rename this option button Screen Selector, and we'll jump into the script and create a variable for that. So I'll just drag and control drop this, and we'll come all the way down to the bottom and we'll create a function, and we'll call this function get screens. And what we can actually do, we can create a variable called screens, and we'll make a call to the display server and we'll use the function getScreenCount. Now this will just return an integer, but we're going to loop through this. So for S in screens, we'll grab the screen selector and we'll use the add item function there. And what we'll do is we'll actually pass in a custom string, and it will be the word screen, semicolon, and a space. And then we'll also add in the screen number. And that'll just be str brackets S. And so it'll show up as like screen 0 or screen 1. There's no way for us to know the name of the screen, so we'll just roll with that. Next, we'll need to connect the signal. So we'll come over to the screen selector, we'll click node, we'll connect that item selected signal once again, and we'll make sure to call this getScreens function in the ready function. And in this signal, once we've actually selected a screen, we're going to get access to the window. So we'll type var underscore window, and we'll just go equals to get window. And then we'll also need to get access to the mode, because that's going to matter when we're in full screen mode in order to switch screens, I found. So we'll get access to the mode, var mode equals underscore window dot get mode. And once we have that, we can pretty much set the window mode to windowed. I'll explain why in a moment. So we'll set the mode to windowed mode, and then we will switch screens. So we'll call underscore window dot set current screen, and it wants an index. We can just pass in the index from the option button. It'll be the same as the screen. And then what we'll do is we'll query the original mode that we got to see if it was full screen. So if it's if the mode is equal to window.mode full screen, we'll set the Windows mode back to full screen. Now, the reason I've done this is because I found that if you're in full screen mode, at least for me with my desktop environment, changing screens in full screen mode doesn't work. So if you go to windowed mode, you switch screens, and then you go back to full screen mode, there's a bit of a flicker, but it's pretty quick. So you don't really notice it, which is pretty good. So we can test this out and see it in action. And I'll choose the next screen, and I had to stop and change my recording so I could record both of my screens so you can see exactly this in action. So it's full screen mode. You click the next screen and it'll just appear on the next one, no problems. So also, just to clarify, screen 0 is my screen on the right. I know that's a bit strange, but the numbers are correct. This is another scene that I've created. It is pretty much a room scan of a room. I'll put the link down below. I have to give credit because it's CC by, but it's not a very efficient mesh is what I'm trying to say, is because like scans aren't good for games. They need to be cleaned up. So it's a good way of sort of demonstrating the amount of frames that you can gain back. So my GPU isn't that sluggish, and it's still only pulling 100 frames at 50% resolution. I can scale up to 200%, and with VSync disabled, I'm getting 40 frames. So, you know, if someone decided to use something so efficient, or, you know, the game, there's a lot going on, you have a 4K resolution, you're only getting 45 frames, you want to get 60, so you switch to AMD FSR and you go to ultra quality and you can scale everything up. Obviously, it's not going to be like 4K for me because I only have a 1080p screen, but you can instantly see the quality and the frames are very high. Now, personally, I think that with AMD FSR, VSync makes everything a million times better, especially in those low quality settings. I'll have something on screen where I've done this with the third person controller demo that comes with Godot, so that there's a bit more action on screen, and I can tell 100% with VSync enabled in performance mode, AMD FSR 2.2 is 100% playable. Like if you've got a laptop that's not got a dedicated card, or you're using a Steam Deck and you're trying to get through something that's like particularly taxing for that device, having this available to your users is mandatory. You need to expose this setting. I'm just going to say that right now. At least that's what I believe. This is at 50% resolution, so 960 by 540, and it's so hard to even tell the difference. This is bilinear, obviously, and we'll drop this down back to 100, and it's it's astounding the difference that you will see here. And so, I don't know what to say. Performance, balanced. It's so good. And you can still tell in action scenes, in movement. So this camera is moving pretty slowly. It's hard to tell the difference. It's a good example of how powerful the software is, but it's not a good representation of what the experience will be like, because, you know, there's going to be a lot happening on screen for a lot of games. But it's still amazing that we have this available to our players with very little effort, totally minimal. So that's great. Alrighty guys, that is it. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was a little bit longer. I decided to take a different approach with this particular project rather than releasing it week by week. Just put out the whole thing all at once. So, you know, sorry it took a little bit longer than it should have to sort of get this content out here, but it's here now, and hopefully you'll be able to do everything that you want to do for your visuals. Let me know if you have any questions. Jump down to the Discord if you need a hand. I'm there. There's a bunch of other people there that can help you. And we're always looking to chat about Godot and game development in general. If you want to support the channel further, you can always jump onto the Patreon, where you'll get access to these tutorial courses about a week earlier, and you'll also get access to a private Discord as well as a YouTube shout out. As always, a like and subscribe is greatly appreciated. That's all for this one, guys. I'm Isaac from Chef Games, and I'll see you next time.